Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. And so begins our story from Genesis chapter 11 that Mimi read for us. Can you just imagine the whole world speaking the same language? Imagine the global benefits of sharing one language. The United Nations convening without the need for translators. Everyone understanding everyone else perfectly. Imagine being able to travel the world with no need for the awkward questions about the bathroom or the mystery foods or finding yourself lost in a random neighborhood. Just imagine the whole world with a common language and one speech. It might not be such a bad idea, right? Think of how much embarrassment we could avoid. Take, for example, a multinational corporation like Pepsi-Cola. So this happened in the 1960s. Pepsi came out with the slogan, "Come alive, you're in the Pepsi generation." But in China, one of Pepsi's biggest new markets, the slogan was mistranslated to mean, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave." Now, in a culture where people worship their ancestors, this was a serious claim and a big problem. Not only was it terribly embarrassing for Pepsi, but it cost a lot of money to fix. Our story this morning, the story of the Tower of Babel, or the story of the confusion of languages, as it's sometimes called, is familiar to a lot of people. But unlike the creation and flood stories that many cultures have in common, this story is unique to the Hebrew tradition. Most of us understand it as a simple parable about human pride and arrogance, which it is. It is a rather simple story when you look at it the first time, explaining to an ancient people how the world became populated after the flood and why there are so many different languages. At the same time, it also clearly warns of the dangers of becoming too big for your britches, as they say in the South. Perhaps it was a story that mothers told their young children who were asking the countless why questions. "Mom, why? Why did they talk funny? Why can't I understand them?" But if we narrow our focus to look at this story from the vantage point of the Israelites for whom it was written, we discover something more. If you are a Hebrew parent raising your children in exile in a foreign land, the question is probably, why do I have to speak this language when all of my friends speak something different? If you are in exile in a foreign land, trying to teach your religious and cultural identity to your children, then this is another story of your heritage. Its purpose is to remind you of why you work to remain faithful to your God, who is far greater than the God of your captors. For us today, we can all think of people who might feel like exiles in our culture. We might think about parents today who feel exiled as they're raising their children in unsafe and rundown neighborhoods where drug dealers and other temptations are helping to take their children and fall prey to all of these temptations. Today, we might think of teachers and youth leaders who try so hard to keep our students on track, reminding them that they have so much potential in a culture that often tries to tell them otherwise. We might think of the grandparents who faithfully pick up their grandchildren every Sunday morning and bring them to church, hoping that their encouragement might have an impact on that child's faith in the future. These are just some of the existential exiles in our culture today. We really are not that unlike the Israelites in that way, because more and more we find that people are not interested in learning the practices of faith that we know are crucial for true and abundant life. We try to teach our children and our grandchildren a way of being and of using their time that is becoming less and less popular in our growing anti-religious culture. So let's take a closer look at what else this story might be saying. Genesis chapter 10 tells us that after the flood, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who did just as God had commanded, and they went out and they populated the world. They became 3 different tribes, and over time, they became many different cultures and nations with different languages. They relocated in 3 distinct regions of the ancient world. The genealogy in chapter 10 especially points us to the people who developed from 2 of Noah's sons. First is Ham, who gives rise to the Canaanites and the Babylonians, and who will later give Israel a lot of grief. And then the second, Shem, the son whose lineage leads us to Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel. According to chapter 10, the people who migrated from the east and settled on the plain of Shamir, which is modern-day Iran, are the Canaanites, Amorites, and the Babylonians. The Hebrew writers fully intended through this story to paint the Babylonians as the foolish ones, and it is just a matter of time before their arrogance will bring them down. This is not only a story about the dangers of human pride, but it's about the coming destruction that an Israelite would expect God to rain down on their captors. The satire in the story is that the Babylonians, who are responsible for scattering the great nation of Israel, are soon to be scattered themselves and left powerless because of a silly little thing like words. If you are Babylonian, your gods have no power to save you. And in the end, you are as weak as the words that scatter you. So let's remind ourselves about the Babylonians. The Babylonians are self-serving, power-hungry, and shallow-minded. Exactly like the gods they served, the Mesopotamian kings had an ancient tradition to build giant monuments to themselves called ziggurats. They would say, "It's top in the heavens," one of the exaggerated claims that each king would make about the superior height of his ziggurat. The tower in our reading today is named Babel, which means gate of God in the ancient language of Babylonians. Now, this might be an ancient story written by ancient people, but that doesn't mean that it isn't sophisticated in its linguistic structure. In Babylonian, it means gate of God, but in Hebrew, it's a word of Balal, which means to mix or confuse or to baffle. Even today, we're familiar with this. We have a word, babble. It's a word that we could use now to mean an unintelligible utterance that doesn't make sense. Hebrew scholar Robert Alter tells us that the Hebrew and Aramaic root words found in the story come together in a clever play on words. According to Alter, the prose itself turns the language into a game of mirrors. For example, a more accurate translation of "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly" would be translated as "Let us brick bricks and burn for a burning." It's something that we might be familiar with when we think of Mother Goose. Or other similar riddles. How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? You're all familiar with that saying. And we know, as 21st century people, that sometimes the words that come together just don't make sense. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us if we don't get all of the meaning from this ancient story. But here is the question for all of us. Where do you find yourself in the story? Does it reveal a prideful spirit, maybe even in some of the areas of your life that you are passionate about? Or maybe it reveals a tendency for you to push back against authority. Or maybe it reflects a temptation that you struggle with. Maybe a temptation to place things or reputation over people and love and God. We can see ourselves in the story individually in our own way. What are we faced with within the story of the Tower of Babel? As a nation and a culture, what 21st century towers scatter us? Perhaps we're facing ourselves using accomplishments and power and technology as an attempt to elevate ourselves over God. In that light, it often seems like the growing cultural message is that we don't need the God of an ancient people. Believe it or not, every church has its own language too. And how we use it greatly affects the differences that we can make in the world. If our language is united through a common mission of love, then the imprint on the community will be broad and transformative. And so I ask you, here at Desert Skies, what language do you speak? The purpose statement of Desert Skies is to be a joyful community drawing people to Christ. The reality is that sometimes circumstances in the world and in our own lives do not always lead us to have a joyful outward appearance. People are suffering. There are divisions in our community, in our families, in our world. And the reality is that sometimes this has serious consequence, and we need serious thought and serious conversation and courageous action. As Christians, we draw on the kind of joy that the Apostle Paul reminds us is the joy of a Christian, a joy that sources our positivity in the face of destruction and discouragement, a joy that comes from a spirit of humility and harmony, found through a life centered in Christ, not in external recognition. Ours is a joy and peace that comes from the contentment in knowing that we are God's beloved, and our lives are centered in the purposes of Christ lived in us. This is the time of year in the Methodist Church when churches around the world take a fresh look at where God is calling them to go in the coming year and in the years ahead. In our local churches, and I know here at Desert Skies, all of your ministry teams and leaders are discerning and praying and having conversations about who God has called you to be next and how to lead the church. I know that Desert Skies speaks a united language of love and deep joy in the world. You speak this language through your music and your worshiping together, through the many missions that you have organized based on the real needs in the world and in your community. And you speak this language through the love and support that you show to children and youth and families, not only within your congregation, but within your city and beyond. And so let this story be a source of inspiration and accountability for you today and in the coming days. Perhaps during the pandemic, you found yourself fearful or stepping back, possibly at the expense of being unable to participate in God's mission. Or maybe you've discovered over these past months a new language of love and passion that matches with others here, but you haven't yet taken the next step to reach out and connect. And so this is a reminder that if you have passion that is motivated by love and is shared with others, that God will bless it and will use it to build thriving relationships. May all that you do together be for the purpose of joyfully leading your neighbors to Christ. As you teach others to follow Jesus, living each day a Christ-like life that serves the world and cares lovingly for the community. My prayer for each of you and for your congregation is that as you reflect upon this ancient story, this timeless and universal story, that you find the language of your heart beating with a new passion, and in unity with the particular ministry that is here, and that you will take the next step to connect with your pastor and your ministry leaders and let them know that you want to be the voice of hope and joy to a scattered, confused, and hurting world. May it be so in the name of Christ. Amen.